Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now nearing the end of our fourth season, but we remain just as excited as ever to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here, we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung, heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show in our July theme of food production. And today we're going to focus in on the intersection of environment and economics. Now, food production is absolutely essential, an essential part of our daily lives, and it's impossible to separate food production from our environment. Food, which is a primary purpose of agriculture, is essential for all living organisms to survive and flourish. But for human beings, food transcends the biological needs and has long been an integral part of social life and culture. Over the past century, the food system has done very well in terms of producing enough food to outpace population growth and in reducing the real price of food to make it more accessible. Indeed, agriculture is an economic engine. It can help reduce poverty for about 75% of the world's poor who live in rural areas and work mainly in farming. It can raise incomes. It can improve food security and benefit the environment. But there are significant trade-offs for all of us that have become more and more pressing with each passing day. And yet, against this significant contribution to global well-being, the global food system, as currently organized, is not doing very well for its purposes. It imposes very high environmental and health costs ranging from greenhouse gas emissions, land degradation, water and air pollution, overdrawn aquifers, and biodiversity loss, all the way to food-borne diseases, growing antimicrobial resistance, and persistent under- and malnourished children, as well as rising obesity. So, what is the net verdict? Is the global food system adding or subtracting monetary value? Well, it is estimated that the value of global agricultural production is just over $5 trillion, and it's estimated that the food system generates 2 to 5 times as much value as farm production itself. Now, we know, for example, in the U.S., for every $1 spent on food by the U.S. consumer, a mere 11 cents are accounted by economic activity on farms, while the rest accrues to numerous activities associated with transforming, delivering, or increasingly preparing the food Americans enjoy on a daily basis. The same is true in the United Kingdom, where agriculture accounts for only 10% of the value of the food system. And since the after the farm to the on-the-farm ratio of value in the food system is much lower in developing countries, its estimated value of the global food system is roughly $8 trillion or 10% of the $80 trillion global economy. Now, the calculation of environmental and health costs are much less straightforward, and environmental and health costs are not reflected in the current market prices of our associated food commodities. Nevertheless, these costs are significant, they are growing, and estimates could point to priority challenges and trigger important conversations around food policy solutions. It's estimated that negative impacts associated with the way the current food system operates are at least $6 trillion. And conservatively speaking, it only accounts for about 5 externalities of the current food system that existing studies have been able to put a value to. And those are namely malnutrition, food loss and waste, food safety, land degradation, and the greenhouse emissions from current agriculture practices. There are also likely substantial costs associated with other issues that have not yet been accounted for. So, who will pay these costs? Well, everyone pays the public health cost of an increase in diet-related diseases through gradually increasing taxes as well as health care. But the substantial costs due to environmental and natural resource damage will primarily be paid for by our future generations as food production becomes much more difficult on a significantly eroded resource base and in a much more hostile climate. The risk that some of these costs will continue to rise exponentially, posing a significant threat to future ecological and hence economic stability, is significant. Now, these shocking numbers only matter if they can motivate us all to action. Fortunately, technologies and practices really already exist that can make agriculture and the broader food production system more climate smart and more environmentally friendly. The food and agriculture sector is almost entirely under private ownership and is composed of an estimated 2.1 million farms, approximately 950,000 restaurants, and more than 200,000 registered food manufacturing, processing, and storage facilities. And so this sector accounts roughly for about 1/5 of our nation's economic activity. That's a lot. Now, the food and agriculture sector has some critical dependencies with other sectors. But particularly, food and agriculture has critical dependencies on water and wastewater systems that they depend on for clean irrigation and processed water, critical dependencies on the transportation systems for the critical and necessary movement of products and livestock. There's a critical dependency on energy to power the equipment needed for agriculture production and food processing that we'd like to minimize, and critical dependency on chemicals. Again, we'd like to minimize these for fertilizers and pesticides used in the production of crops. So this is a lot. But here today to help us explore and unpack some of this are two experts, and they're going to make us smarter. With us today are Sean Cash. Sean is an economist and the Bergstrom Foundation professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy at Tufts University. Sean teaches and conducts research on the consumer behavior around food, nutrition, and the environment, as well as environmental impacts in food production. Sean is the founding co-editor of the Food Policy and Economics section of Frontiers in Nutrition, and he was also editor of the Canadian Journal of Agriculture Economics. Welcome, Sean, and did I get all of that right?
Yes, you did, and thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Sean, for making time to be with us today. Our other guest is Doug Petry. Doug is with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And the World Business Council is a CEO-led community of over 200 of the world's leading sustainable businesses working collectively to accelerate the system transformations needed for a net zero, nature positive, and more equitable future. And there, Sean manages their One Planet Business for Biodiversity. And this is a project within their agriculture and food pathway. It's an action-oriented, cross-sectional coalition of more than 30 companies that are looking to protect and restore biodiversity in agriculture value chains. Doug leads the coalition's work on financing regenerative systems and establishing the business case for regenerative agriculture for both farmers and for corporations. Welcome, Doug. Did I get all of that right?
You did, yes. Pleasure to be here, Bernice.
Thank you all. And again, thank you so much for making time to join us. And we just have a little bit to go before we go to break. So, Doug, I want to ask you a little bit more, though, about the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. What was the impetus for that organization?
Sure. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development came out of one of the first COP summits on the environment, looking to bring together a consolidated business voice for ambitious companies who are looking to make positive changes to their value chains to support environmental outcomes, and really bringing businesses as a leading voice in the solution to the environmental crisis that we face, as opposed to purely being a negative impact.
Indeed, because typically most of us do not think of businesses as leading the way there. And again, really briefly, can you tell us some of the things or accomplishments this group has done since the first COP?
Certainly. So WBCSD has brought together businesses from all different sectors, looking to enact policy reform that will support businesses as a cause for good, put together frameworks that support businesses in transforming their value chains to consider environmental impacts as well as economic impacts, and looking to redefine value for these businesses in a way that supports all kind of stakeholders within the mission.
Right. Is there anything notable that many of us might recognize that has come from their efforts?
Certainly. I mean, I think we are a leading voice within the COPs, bringing together kind of positive outcomes, kind of pushing countries and corporates to make commitments that include environmental outcomes as well as economic ones. And I apologize for not being as versed on the kind of history of the WBCSD. My focus is more so on the One Planet Business for Biodiversity initiative, which has been a member project of WBCSD since 2019 as a subset and fully integrated last year.
Indeed. Thank you for giving us just a brief description of what they do and their significance and certainly their participation in pushing those areas of the COP forward. We're going to be right back with our guest after the break. We are with Dr. Sean Cash with Tufts University and Doug Petry with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We'll be right back with them on the other side to make us much smarter. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, The Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority, for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all H-E-B stores, natural grocers, all central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. To today's show on food production, focusing in on the intersection of environment and economics. And we are back with Sean Cash at Tufts University and Doug Petry with the World Business Council. Again, thank you all so much for making time for us today. And so, Doug, I want to go back to you, though, and start us out by talking to us about how food production impacts the environment and what are some of the key environmental challenges today that are associated with it. And I gather the environmental challenges are really changing over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Food production has a tremendous impact on the environment. Currently, the food system that we have in place goes beyond the planetary boundaries. The impact is on climate from GHG emissions, on nature from deforestation, overuse of pesticides and synthetic inputs, a loss of pollinators, global biodiversity loss. And there's a lot of emerging, agricultural practices that can transform these negative impacts into positive impacts on nature and on climate through the adoption of regenerative agriculture. So I think right now it is really a critical point in our where we sit in a food system to really consider how we are producing our food, how we are transporting our food, and how we are bringing nature and climate as part of those considerations. into it. So looking to be more positive towards these, what would initially be considered externalities, but are really core elements of the production of food.
And so that our listeners really get a good grasp of what we're talking about, can you briefly, Doug, just list the components, kind of starting at the beginning with the farm, of the food production system? Most of us know food on the plate, take, fork, spoon, eat it. We know about farms and farmers markets, but other than that, it's the disconnect. So can you walk us really briefly through the food production system consists of?
Yeah, absolutely. So, food production systems really can even start before the farm, looking at kind of input providers who are developing, fertilizers, pesticides that are then going onto the farm to support, yield outcomes for farmers. Then you have the on-farm production, which can be, row crops, cattle, dairy. Obviously, every food value chain has very significantly different practices that they are adherent to. From there, you go into distribution. So this would be kind of selling to an elevator or a third party that will then kind of hold and deliver them to manufacturing. And then from there, manufacturing will go into, the development of of a product that ends up on a store shelf or in a restaurant potentially. So there are, multiple different kind of food value chains and a lot of different kind of steps before it reaches the consumer's plate.
Indeed. And so I want to kind of summarize that and then pull in Sean, because that's more his specialty is the food. But it starts before the farm, but I think I would like to, for the consumer, so it starts with the farm. The food is grown, or the livestock is grown and cultivated. Then it's distributed to some entity that will hold it, then get it transported. So transportation is another node. It gets transported to a manufacturer, or, for lack of a better word, somebody's going to prepare it or process it. The evil processing of food. And then from processing, it goes, where, Sean? Can you take us from there?
Sure. I mean, yes, we have, food processing and manufacturing, and, then these things are distributed. Most of the food we're buying and consuming in this country are things that we're buying in retail environments, right? We're thinking of grocery stores, super centers, increasingly at dollar stores, also at farmers markets. But most of our food acquisition in the United States is through a market system, right? So these things are going from the manufacturers and processors, usually to wholesalers, distributors, and then onto the supermarket shelf, right? So much of our food acquisition experience is going to the supermarket, going to the farmer's market, making a decision about what to buy, considering our affordability, the things we like to eat, our convenience. Am I going to be able to prepare this to feed to myself and my family? All these things before we get to that, food on the plate that you mentioned.
And in the fork, indeed. So between all of us here, we probably mentioned about 5 or 6 basic steps, knowing that there's a whole lot more, especially on the back end. That's a lot of steps in this food processing system. And it seems to me that each of those steps, even with us going to the grocery or the farmer's market or whatever to pick up the food, each of those steps is intersecting with various aspects of our environment. And each of those steps has an economic cost that most of us really don't pay attention to. And again, we want to just shed some more light on that. And it's important that everybody understand it's very complex to get us there to the fork in the plate. Now, earlier, Doug had mentioned regenerative farming or regenerative agriculture, which we hear over and over and over again. Can you explain what that is, Sean, in terms that maybe the average consumer can identify with? Explain what it is, but connect it to something that perhaps we already know or understand.
I can suggest that'd be something more appropriate for Doug to respond to.
What, Doug?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about regenerative agriculture. And really, it's a holistic approach to farming, as opposed to focusing exclusively on, yields or some outcome. Regenerative systems are looking at promoting above and below ground carbon sequestration, reducing greenhouse emissions through kind of nature, protecting and enhancing biodiversity in and around farms, improving water retention in the soil, reducing pesticides, and being more efficient in uses of fertilizers along the way. And I think that these are kind of holistic outcomes that are looking to be generated, but there are different practices that help support that, be it cover cropping or intercropping, diversifying rotations, no-till or low-till systems, as well as integrating livestock onto the farm. So all of these kind of go to develop regenerative systems that are focused on nature and environmental outcomes, in addition to kind of the product at the end of the system.
How do consumers know that the food they're eating, or how can they know that the food that they're eating has been produced with regenerative agriculture methods, and why should they care about that?
Well, I think that there are a few ways, and we're very much kind of in an emerging state right now. So currently, I think if you go to a farmer's market, you can certainly talk to a farmer, ask them about their production methods. Are they doing regenerative agriculture? Have they heard of it or explored it in any capacity? The second would be looking at different certification schemes along the way. You can think of the Regenerative Organic Alliance. Sean, I think you might be able to chime in here as well with some really great insights.
Let me ask you this, though. Is it that if it's organic, then it's been farmed regeneratively? Or is it that if you buy it at the farmer's market, then it's been farmed regeneratively? Or not necessarily?
No, on both of those. Unfortunately, it requires a little bit more, in-depth probing and research. And there is a distinction between organic and regenerative. Organic is looking at the elimination of all kind of synthetic inputs, whereas regenerative is looking at more nature-positive outcomes. So it does allow for the use of minimal and considered inputs, as well as a system that's focused on outputs. But I'll pass it over to Sean here, because I think that he's got maybe a little bit better connection to the consumer.
Can you weigh in on that a little bit for us, Sean?
Sure thing. Yeah. I mean, specifically with regenerative agriculture, consumers don't really know what the phrase means. I think a lot of practitioners are still figuring out exactly what they mean by that and what's in and out of bounds. But when we think of, you asked about communicating this to consumers, right? And there's a real challenge there. So when we're communicating things to consumers, we want, consumers, when we're at that grocery store or at the farmer's market or wherever else, there's a lot of things competing for our attention. And we often think about this communication happening through labels on food packaging or on a shelf, right? So with the organic program, the National Organic Program in the United States Department of Agriculture came up about close to 30 years ago now with a set of standards as to what organic meant, and developed a program that, translated into labeling. And as Doug mentioned, it's really about the inputs. Whether or not you can call something organic and have something certified as organic depends on the inputs and the practices you use. And a lot of it's about not using certain inputs or practices. And it's not focused on the outputs. And the interest in regenerative agriculture is to get to that. In some ways, also regenerative agriculture and a few other things that are really hot topics these days are also reactions to what we lost by defining organics in ways that could be communicated clearly to consumers with government standards. So I think the government standards are a strength. It does help prevent fraud. It does put more common understanding on what organic means, but it also leaves a lot of things that we care about to the wayside. With regenerative agriculture, we're in a different spot, right? There are companies that are trying to play around with communicating this to consumers. It's hard to explain something as complex and as wide-reaching as regenerative agriculture in a label or on a little bit of explanatory marketing text on the side of a box or in 30 seconds.
And we're going to go to break. We will come back on the other side so that Dr. Sean Cash and Doug Petry can continue to make us smarter. But when we come back, I do want to kind of put a period in our regenerative agriculture communication issue. We'll be right back on the other side. Thank you. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. to today's show on food production, the intersection of environment and economics. And we are back with Sean Cash from Tufts University and Doug Petry with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they really are making us smarter. Now, before the break, we were trying to get a little bit better grasp or understanding of regenerative agriculture. And I think for me, probably the most important thing that was said is that it's not about outputs, but more about the input, what goes into that farming element of producing our food. Now, on one of our last shows, I think a word I was really pushing people on the same issue, better communication of what regenerative farming means, because people, it's a new buzzword, and there's a tendency not to grasp or not to pay attention because they don't understand it. And one of our guests used a word that I think a lot of people can identify when they said restorative. In other words, restoring farming, the soil, the farm, raising livestock back to how it used to be before it became perhaps industrialized and before perhaps a lot of things and inputs were made to make it more efficient and to increase productivity. So it's kind of like going back to how it used to be is what we got from there. But I want to ask you, Doug, looking at the concept of the term sustainable agriculture and regenerative, what's the difference in those, or can people assume we're generally talking about the same thing?
Yeah, I think that regenerative agriculture is focused on outcomes for soil health, for biodiversity, and for nature, and is looking to kind of replenish what was lost in a way. Whereas, I think it gets to a point of kind of nitpicking in definitions, and sustainable agriculture can be, very broad in a lot of ways. I think that, regenerative agriculture could be considered under a subset of sustainable agricultural practices, but the real core focus of regenerative ag is to build soil health, build nutrients in the soil. I think that Sean can probably speak to the connection between nutrient density in food coming from regenerative farming practices. Or I know that there are a few early studies kind of coming out and showcasing that link there. So it's really being more additive to a system in a kind of healthy and holistic way.
Indeed. Thank you because you did, I think, increase our understanding is that regenerative ag is really a subset or comes under sustainable. It's something that you do. It's part of developing a sustainable agriculture system. And so I think people can grasp that because most people have a sense of the definition of sustainable. It's something that's self-generating and that will last for future generations. And so we engage in regenerative agriculture, which is more about the inputs and soil health as we raise food, as we raise livestock. And so that then helps to develop that sustainable system. So I think that's probably a good way to encapsulate it. So Sean, can you tell us, though, about the role that technology plays in promoting sustainable food production, and what are some of the innovative solutions or approaches that have been implemented in terms of technology to move forward our food system?
Sure thing. And one thing I just want to say about technology is, the way that I, as an economist, define technology is any way we mix together different inputs to get the outputs that we want from a system, right? So it's not just about the newest and fanciest gadgets. It's really about any knowledge that we might have that helps us, in this case, produce the food we need to eat, right? So that can include things like regenerative and restorative practices. It also includes indigenous knowledge, as well as high-tech gadgetry that might help us better feed ourselves or better sustain the planet, right? So technology is a very broad concept indeed. And I think we often think of this very modernist, high-tech implication of technology, but it can be much broader than that. So, there's also a tension between those approaches we think of when we think about the role of technology that focus on better harmonization with our natural environments, like regenerative ag that we've been talking about, and those approaches that seek to bring food production at scale into more controlled environments. So things like vertical farming and other intensive indoor methods, or something I've been working on, cellular agriculture projects that actually seek to produce animal-based proteins, not in the bodies of living creatures, but in bioreactors. So these are very different visions of the future. And I might be a bit optimistic, but I actually think we need to actually keep researching and attempting practice on all tracks at the same time. We need better harmonize things, sometimes going back to things we've done in the past and seeing about what we've lost as we've moved away from things, as well as thinking about things that we've never tried before. Because we are trying to feed 8 billion people, and we want to do it in sustainable ways.
And I am hearing a lot about something you mentioned, and I think Doug mentioned it earlier too, and that's going back. You called it indigenous practices, and Doug called it something else, but it's going back to how things used to be, looking at perhaps some of the best practices or some of the best things that we can then bring forward. And as you use that term, harmonize with some of the technology and everything. So I think that's a good deal. But Sean, too, I want you to talk to us more, too, about how food production and the environment impact our health. And what are some of the key health challenges associated with how we're currently, or the conventional food production practices?
Sure thing. If I could maybe step back and be a little broader also, because we've used the word sustainable a lot. So we have a project here at Tufts that we call the Lasting Project that actually defines sustainability for food systems in a context that gets at all these things, that sustainable food systems have to be environmentally sustainable, right? We have to stay within our planetary boundaries. But health is part of that, too. If we're not sustaining ourselves and our bodies, it's not sustainable. It's not working for us. That's what we need. It also brings in social sustainability, which would incorporate things like labor practices. If we are relying on exploitative labor practices or things that don't allow us to sustain our social connections and maintain our social values, then it also isn't sustainable in the long term. We can't keep doing things that require or depend upon exploitation of people or giving up these social values. And finally, it also includes affordability. Because I think at the scale of 8 billion people, we are going to be relying on market systems for a large part of our food acquisition for quite a while still. And so affordability is part of how we make sure that access is there for everybody. So we envision sustainable food systems as really having to be sustainable across these 4 different pillars of sustainability. And I think that's important not just for purposes of definition or concepts, because we need to actually do a better job than we've been doing in tracking the impacts across all of these things at the same time. And this is how we're going to figure out, well, what's something that might be good for our health, but is increasing the cost of our foods versus where the win-win-win situations might be. So I hope that's helpful. I'm happy to talk a little bit more directly to health and environment impacts as well. But I think that's something important to think about when we talk about sustainable. We don't just mean the environment. It has to be sustained across all of these pillars.
Indeed. And that leads me to ask you, you mentioned tension, and I guess I would call that trade-offs. And so we know there are trade-offs, but tell us about some of the primary trade-offs between environmental sustainability, economic growth, and public health in the context of food production.
Yeah, ideally we can find ways forward where those trade-offs aren't binding our hands too much, right? I think one of the issues that we've seen coming out of the 20th and the first 20 years of the 21st century is that we focus so much on affordability and doing things at scale that we kind of neglected some of the other benefits that we need from our food system, right? We've created new classes of environmental impacts through the use of our fertilizer and pesticide inputs that we've then had to step back from in the later part of the 20th century as we started to realize some of the true cost of doing that. And also producing foods at scale that we can afford but aren't always the healthiest things for us. So we've very quickly moved, not just in the United States, but in much of the world, to places where underconsumption is not the biggest problem for many of us, but rather the health perils of overconsumption. And we need to hit the right balance on both.
I want to move to Doug now, though, and talk a little bit about the role of industrialized agriculture. I have to think that a lot of the businesses and companies that you work with at the World Business Council are perhaps involved in industrialized agriculture as opposed to, say, the individualized farmer. So what is the role, though, of industrialized agriculture in the regenerative ag future? And also, Doug, you said that there's a positive business case for farmers transitioning to regenerative agriculture. So can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's important to note that there is no single solution, no silver bullet that we have, and no one actor that can, get us to a resilient, sustainable food system. It's going to require action from all actors. I think when you talk about, an industrialized system, it's one that we're entrenched in currently, where we have these kind of large, typically monocrop productions that are going into these large food organizations that are, distributing them nationally and globally. I think, the OP2B coalition of 30 plus business members, have recognized that this kind of status quo, business as usual, is not something that can be sustained in the long term. And it's something that really needs to be renovated and addressed to deliver those positive outcomes, which I think is where the role of regenerative agriculture comes in. And so I know that we're up against a break. Maybe I'll pause here and pick it up after at the business case that we can bring forward.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Doug. We'll be right back on the other side with Doug Petry with the World Business Council and with Sean Cash at Tufts University. And I want you, when we come back, Doug, to talk more about kind of the percentage of our food that's produced by industrialized concerns as opposed to farmers. Thank you. We'll be right back on the other side. And we want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all H-E-B stores, natural grocers, all central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years, non-mercury, with a holistic approach looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. To today's show on food production, the intersection of environment and economics. And we are back with Dr. Sean Cash at Tufts University and Doug Petry with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they really are making us smarter. Now, Doug, before the break, and you were telling us about the business case for farmers transitioning to regenerative agriculture. But before you start that, can you give us a sense, though, of maybe what's the percentage of our food production that comes from industrialized companies as opposed to farmers and other non-industrialized companies?
Certainly. So I don't have a direct figure on this. I believe it's somewhere around 30%, but perhaps Sean might have something a little bit more accurate there. But I think for us, when we look at the business case for farmers in transitioning to regenerative agriculture, it's one that brings together economic prosperity, positive environmental outcomes by kind of adopting and shifting resources and production methods. I think that there is still a tremendous amount of risk that is, assumed in this transition period that farmers currently are bearing the burden of. But we recently published a report called Cultivating Prosperity, Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, that looked at, what would be considered a average wheat farmer in Kansas. And we saw that, while there would be an initial decline in profitability that these farmers would see over a 5 to 10 year time horizon, they would see an increase in profitability of 120% versus conventional kind of agricultural production or the synthetic production that is currently being used. We saw a 15 to 25% return on investment for these farmers. So I think These are adding to environmental outcomes, delivering environmental and ecosystem services, but also really promoting a better livelihood for the farmers, which Sean mentioned earlier as one of the core elements of what a sustainable food system is.
And you said something that I want to bring together and summarize, because it seems to me, and you let me know if this is correct, that by transitioning to regenerative ag, it helps or should help all of us economically or financially. The farmers will have greater output and make more money. And it seems to me then that means that we as consumers might enjoy lower prices and higher quality food. In other words, what does it mean to us? Why should we care about this?
I think that there are a myriad of positive benefits to regenerative production in food, coming from higher nutrient density within food products and increased livelihoods for farmers. In terms of kind of the end effect on the consumer, I think by and large those prices are not necessarily going to shift. You see kind of some margin gain on the farmer's end by reducing their reliance on pesticides and herbicides, which denigrate soil health, which adversely affect biodiversity. So these are positive environmental outcomes that will kind of trickle their way down into water systems, into local communities. And in terms of the kind of consumer end of it, if you're just looking at the price per product on the plate, there won't necessarily be a decrease there, because you're seeing similar production levels that you would be over time from conventional production.
So consumers cannot care about regenerative ag because it's going to reduce our cost. But I want to go to Sean, and he may be able to give us some happier news. From an economic perspective, Sean, what are some of the benefits of promoting access to and consumption of nutritious and sustainably or /regeneratively produced foods? And how does that influence healthcare cost and productivity?
Yeah, we have focused in a lot of ways, in too many ways, on the affordability of food, and sometimes the affordability of the wrong types of food, right? And again, none of this is through bad intentions, but rather where we've been able to find those wins as learning how to do things in reliable, low-cost ways, right? But that's not been always very good for our nutrition and health. So, and we really saw a lot of that in COVID, right? Yes. Where we saw the perils of this low cost at all costs and approach to things, and what's often called just-in-time sourcing, right? Where everything is moving fast, and that's not very resilient when something goes wrong. And things can go wrong because of disruptions from a pandemic, like during COVID. Things can go wrong and are going wrong because of climate change and the impacts that has on our food production systems. So we need to think in terms of resilience. And that means doing things that are going to work more of the time, not just at the best of times, right? And that's really, I think, part of the transformation we need. And I say that with the constant thought in the back of my mind that we're doing a lot of things right. It's easy to pick on the things we do wrong. But a lot of the things that we see that are wrong today in the food system are because of other problems we were fixing that really needed to be fixed.
Such as?
In the United States, we're far more likely to die from the bad effects of overconsumption and at later ages than from the risks of underconsumption. We still have food insecurity and hunger in this country. I don't want to say that we don't.
Right, exactly.
But those impact a much smaller portion of the population than they used to, right? So with some of these problems that we're trying to address now, we need to address, are also things that we have the privilege of addressing because we're doing better at some other things. So how do we keep the best features of what we've learned how to do at scale and move away from some of the things that we've been doing badly or have messed up in the process? And I know that's, I think we all want to see some of those same goals, but it's a different framing about how we consider some of these things. And some of these risks posed by climate change are, I think, really things that the public is still coming to grips with. I think more and more of us know how climate is impacting the amount of food we can produce. I think we're still not talking enough about how climate also impacts the quality of the food we produce. And this has a huge impact on nutrition, as well as our enjoyment of food. So there's been a lot of interesting research to show that the nutrient density of some key nutrients in key crops that sustain population all over the world has been declining. So if we have lower protein content in staple plants, if we have lower zinc or iron content in some things, right, this really impacts some crucial health concerns that we still have in many parts of the world, right? And these things are impacted by climate. I'll stop there, but I could talk a lot more about climate impacts on food quality if we had time.
And one last question on that, though, Sean, is, are there any statistics out there related to the U.S. or someplace else about decline in nutrition value of our foods? And I don't know that they are. I'm just really asking because I've heard this said over and over again as we are discussing other environmental issues on this show. And we talk about climate change impacts on air and so many different things. And many times on those subjects, it still comes back to decrease in nutritional value of our food. So I'm just wondering, are there any statistics out there, any research out there that we might be able to point to or call upon?
Yeah, the research on this is followed two main tracks. One is kind of really trying to look at the nutrient quality in foods that are being produced under different conditions in different parts of the world. And Sam Myers at Harvard is somebody who's been leading a lot of projects on this where they just, using dozens of sites and seeing really how is corn being produced in this part of the world with this soil quality and these temperatures and this amount of rainfall. And then looking at the nutrient quality of that and how is that differing from corn being produced elsewhere and looking at that in wheat and other things, right? And then the other line of research, which I find fascinating, is looking at historical records and stores of some of these plants and seeing how they've changed over time. Lou Ziska is somebody who was at USDA for many years, went to Columbia University a few years ago, and he had access at USDA to some of these historical records, and nobody had really looked at that. And through a combination of changing climate conditions as well as changing practices in agriculture, again, there he saw declines in some key nutrients in some of these key staple crops that we depend on as inputs to so much of our food system. So this is a real concern. It might seem a little less crucial, but also happening very dramatically when we look at things like tea and coffee, things that we enjoy drinking for the taste of, as well as some of the potential health benefits. We've seen the same thing there. Coffee is really under risk right now, and the highest quality coffee is facing the greatest challenge from increasing temperatures in some of our key coffee growing regions in the world, and increasing pest pressures and other challenges that come with climate change. So again, I could go on with a lot of different examples, but it's affecting the taste and sensory qualities of the food we eat. It's impacting the nutrient quality of the food we eat.
Thank you so much, Sean, for bringing those examples forward, because coffee is something that many, if not most of us, can identify with. And again, that's our purpose with Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, is to bring these issues to the forefront so people understand them, they feel informed about them, and then they can see how they're impacting their lives. And so you mentioned coffee and tea, so you've hit the nail on the head today. And many of us hear throughout the year about something freezing or something with temperature that's related to climate change that's affecting usually the availability, but more so the price of our coffee. So this really is all interrelated. You all have made us smarter today, and we appreciate that. And as always, with most of our conversations here on Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, and there's just not enough time. Starts really getting good as we begin to run out of time. So we want to thank you all. We've been today with Dr. Sean Cash, an economist at Tufts University, and Doug Petry with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And Doug manages their One Planet Business for Biodiversity, where he works with a lot of businesses and business CEOs dealing with, studying, and trying to attack this issue of our food production from a more environmentally sustainable standpoint. So thank you all again for making time for us today. You have made us smarter, and we look forward to having you back with us at a later date to make us smarter. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is the result of a trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you, and join us again next week for more on food production, agriculture, and land use, how it affects our environment and our health. Thank you.